Welcome to the Ben and Tony podcast, and today we have a special guest, Ian Crocombe. Ian is the founder of Deft, a culture and commerce advisory company that helps scale up D2C brands and traditional retailers grow their e-commerce business. Ian was formerly the director of Facebook Creative Shop for global clients, where he led a distributed team of creatives and strategists working with brands like Adidas, L'Oreal, and VW. And prior to this, Ian was the VP of Innovation at American Express and held senior strategy roles at various digital agencies, including AKQA, M&C Saatchi, and Possible. Ian's career has always put him at the forefront of media and culture. From working at an old school publishing company, to digital advertising agencies, to American Express, to Facebook's Creative Shop, to now his own company called Deft. With wit, humility, and a positive mindset that is always focused on learning, Ian covers each step in his life as a thrilling chapter mirroring the evolution of technology. The world of digital media and advertising has changed a lot since Ian was designing CD-ROMs for clients in the 90s, but he's always managed to stay up to date. Hope you enjoy this one.
And we're very, very excited to be sponsored by the Making Lemonade Fund, Gen Z's fastest growing fundraiser, supporting COVID-19 relief, pediatric cancer, and a bunch of other great causes. Get behind them over at makinglemonadefund.com and sponsor made by our very own Jesse K.
Hey, Anthony. Hey, Ben. Lovely to see you.
Great to have you. Great to have you. No, so Ian, I mean, when you were, before we get into the first moment of transition, the big turning point, it was one of your first jobs in your 20s. Can you tell us a bit more about, I guess, your earlier years and how you got involved in the world of, I guess we describe it as tech or media or advertising or marketing? Like, what were you doing before you were getting into the workforce? What were your passions?
Yeah. So that's super interesting. I mean, so I was born in 72, so I'm 48 now. So I grew up kind of, I guess, like late 70s in the 80s. So like Stranger Things times. So lots of Dungeons and Dragons, lots of
Nice.
role-playing games, kind of imagination-wise, which I think is
Yeah.
really good for kind of like marketing and advertising. And like my buddies were writing supplements for Dungeons and Dragons, like and getting them published, and we were all quite
Wow.
deep into the scene and running play-by-mail games. So you do role-playing, and you would write a letter to someone, and it would be like a story, and you would subscribe every month. You would get these letters, and you would write back saying what you would do, like
Oh, that,
old school stuff.
oh, I want to. We should have that in the 21st century.
Yeah, yeah, super
Could
slow.
you, yeah, can you explain how that works? I think I've heard of this before, but to me, the concept, I think for most people listening, would still be hard to grasp, right? So it's like a turn-based game where you write a letter describing your move, and you hear back from like a dungeon master
Yeah.
Who's in like the mail repository that gets back to you. How does it work
Exactly.
exactly?
So so play by mail, or PBM was the name, I seem to remember. And we had a guy who was a really good writer who we knew called Jeff. He was like, right, I'm going to set this PBM game up. I've got this world that I've created. You're going to pay me an amount of money per month, which was probably the same as the postage. I'm going to write you a letter like twice a month with a story that explains what's going on. You have to write me a letter back. And so we literally paid a subscription of probably like £2 a month or something like this, which paid for the postage and probably his cigarettes and coffee, and yeah. And so that was it. But it was that early world of like imagination, storytelling, interactivity, very early,
Yeah.
I guess.
And is that what influenced you, I guess, as you went to school and or your first parts of your career? Were you interested? I guess it sounds like a common thread might have been pursuing things that required some sort of creative output.
Yeah, I think so. I think we were super lucky. My dad was a software engineer, so he'd like worked as a telephone engineer originally in the '60s for the post office and been climbing up telephone poles. And computers at the time were hardware problems; they weren't software problems. So he was working as an engineer, and he'd have to stay up all night and change valves and things, and swap punch cards over and tapes and stuff. And he learnt to program COBOL and had ended up so by the kind of like mid '80s, I always had bits of computers in the house. And I remember my dad and one of the maths teachers, who was a Polish emigre, they basically set up programming classes for kids when we were 12. and we hadn't really seen computers, so they would be talking about like
in the 80s.
Yeah, in the 80s, like address packets and all this kind of stuff. So yeah, so we were very lucky. So I always had this like weird computer thing going on, and then this kind of creativity thing going on. And I could kind of sense that technology was changing things, you know. We moved to France when I was 16, and we had, and I can't remember the name of it now. We basically had the French had a version of CFAX, so one of these French kind of dial-up systems, where you could basically like book train tickets. And there was a weird porn thing that I could never make work, but there was that as well, you know.
Wow.
Yeah.
Yeah. So I mean, you had this mixture of tech in your life, considering that software and tech wasn't necessarily as ubiquitous as it is now, considering this is in the 80s. But you also had this like creative side to what you're interested in when you were younger.
Yeah, that's it. I mean, we all played instruments and played guitar and stuff like that. So my dad, my brother, you know, kind of everyone. So it's a lot of creativity sort of mixed with technology, but there was no real intention there. It was just kind of stuff we were interested in. You know.
And how did that lead to the first big moment that you're going to talk about, where you're working at a printer when you're in your 20s, like between when you were growing up, having all these influences to that point? How did you get to getting that job at a printer?
So yeah, so I ended up doing a degree in philosophy in University of East Anglia Norwich, which is not the most prestigious university, and I didn't get the highest grades either. So it's fair to say I had a really good time there, and this is like the early 90s. So no, we had a lot of fun and we partied a lot and we were in bands and all that kind of stuff. So we weren't very academic people, but I got a real love for culture, I guess, like for music, for records, and all this kind of stuff. And so I came out of there and ended up working in record shops in London. As a record buyer down at Music and Tape Exchange in Notting Hill, which is like a very famous secondhand record store.
Nice.
Which is, and I ended up working in the computer department there, and it was just kind of all kinds of crazy, basically. But eventually I found a job in Hoxton in East London, which was in a printers at the time. And I met the guy and they were like, we need someone to be an account exec. And I was like, what's that? He's like, well, you have to keep the client happy and you have to make sure the work's done on time, you know? So you're kind of like a sales guy. And it was basically overnight printing. So all the banks were printing research. So it would be like, buy this stock, sell that stock, and they would print the research, ABN AMRO, Warburgs, all these investment banks. And they would send it to us. We would lay it up in Quark Express. They'd been laying it out to output the plates to put on the printing press.
So wait, what is Quark Express? Like, how does this work exactly? Like the printing process for someone that might not know. Yeah.
So at the time, we were just transitioning to desktop publishing. It was called. So we were just starting to use computers. Previously, the guys would have printed out something, or effectively they would have like mocked something up using tape and using a scalpel. Then they would have shot that with a bellows camera. Then from that, they would have outputted film and then exposed that to a plate and then put that on a printing press. Wow. So you didn't just kind of push print on shit. It was complicated. Yeah. But Quark was basically like Photoshop is for digital graphics. Yeah. So it enabled you to like manipulate stuff, balance color, add fonts, embed stuff. So, but this was like kind of a big revolution. I ended up working. Oh, sorry, Ben.
No, I was going to say, what was that kind of early adoption of technology like when you're actually on the ground? I mean, are people a bit reluctant to use stuff? Like, how are people viewing it?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, what do they say? That technology is something that was, what do they say? Technology is something that was invented after I was born. So anything you're born with doesn't feel like technology, does it? Like toasters or tarmac or electricity. But anything that's new, like TikTok or like Bitcoin, you're like, ooh, this feels odd.
Yeah.
So it's definitely that thing of people who've grown up doing things a certain way and it felt very normal to them, and it's hard to change, isn't it? You see it today.
Because presumably you were one of the younger people working at that printing company, but there were surely have been a lot of older people that maybe looked at the technological change as, with more hesitation than what you did, because this is like one of your first jobs, right? And you probably had that young, open mind versus maybe your colleagues that were 10, 20 years older than you.
Yeah, I think so. And I think that I think everyone could see the world was moving quickly. So email was just being introduced, which was super cool. We were lucky. We also had like a Japanese publisher that was part of the same business. So we were publishing a lot of like cultural magazines around Japan as well. We had a big Japanese department there. So that meant that we had to use things like file transfer protocol to upload very large files over to Tokyo. And one night I accidentally left it connected, and I think we had like a £2,000 bill, which is probably more than I earned in about 6 months. So, but so it was all that kind of early technology that nearly works, but not quite.
What happened at that point? Like what was your time like when you were there, and what happened to the company as you spent more time there?
Yeah, I mean, it was a great company, very entrepreneurial. We had a great technical director there who I became really good friends with. This is at a time where the pubs in the UK had to close at 11 o'clock, and we were an overnight printer. And so I was given a mobile phone, my first mobile phone, which was a very large blue Ericsson, which now it would look like a weapon or something, but it's enormous. And I was like, this is amazing, I get a phone. But I didn't realize it was so that when there was problems on the overnight printing, it meant the guy who was running the printing press could phone you. And of course, what the printers would do is as soon as we all left in the evening at 8 or 9 o'clock, they would then go to the pub, and they would get locked in the pub because the pubs all had lock-ins, all the printers' pubs. So they would come out at 2 in the morning. They would then go to the printing press, and they would realize they didn't have the right paper, or they would put the film on backwards or something, and they would phone you at 2 in the morning. That's why I had the phone. So they could phone me and say, oh, we've run out of 120 GSM high white paper. What shall I use? And I'd be like, what do you recommend? Oh, this other one looks the same. I'd be like, use that paper then. Amazing. So lots of learning, basically, lots of the interface between sort of like client briefs and reality, I think. But that was cool. And then I guess as the internet was coming on board, we started experimenting a lot with digital publishing. So myself and Arthur, the technical director, Arthur's really the brains behind it all. But he was like, hey, man, I can build this template, because all the analysts were writing in Microsoft Word. And he was like, I can build this template so they can type into it, and I can output a PDF from it, which looks like a printed document, but it's actually electronic, and then we could email that. Because at the time...
Was that completely at the time? Sorry, I think you probably would have explained this, but was that completely novel at the time?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, PDFs were pretty new out from Adobe. And they were just figuring out what the use case was. I mean, why would you want to be able to have something that was ready to print but then not be able to print it? It was kind of crazy. So, and we would use it for soft proofs and stuff like that to begin with, so you could get someone to sign something off. But and we were using a lot of couriers, so we would print stuff out at 4 in the morning. Guy in a van would come over, and then he would run it over to the airport, or drive over to the airport, and then it would go to Amsterdam, Frankfurt, all the major financial centers, and it would be on the analyst desks at 6 or 7 in the morning. And we'd figured out we could make these PDFs, and so we started making them as a test. And we said to the clients, look, hey, we could give you this service as well, which is going to be more valuable, more premium. And they were like, that's amazing. Could you email the research over to us in that format? And we were like, yep, we can do that. And they thought it was brilliant, and they absolutely loved it. But what we saw in the end was that they just stopped printing stuff, and they just started using the PDF publishing system instead, which obviously wasn't as profitable as the print one. And I think the printer ended up going out of business afterwards.
Wow. So the business was literally cannibalized by technology. And you witnessed, were you there? Did the company actually go out of business when you were still there?
Yeah, I mean, I was really good friends with the owners of it, and we ended up renting buildings off of them but they ended up going over. Yeah. And a lot of the couriers, printers, all around the edge of the financial district in London, which is like Hackney and Liverpool Street, which is where we were at the time. It was all support services for the banks, and so all of those guys now, when you could suddenly send PDFs, it looks a lot less attractive having all those courier fees. Yeah.
Wow. Because it seems like you literally witnessed a firsthand example of how technology can disrupt. I mean, that word's kind of overused, but you know what I mean? It's literally stopped parts of businesses and businesses that were no longer needed due to technology. What were some things you learned from that?
I think I hadn't read Clay Christensen at the time, and I hadn't, I don't even know if he'd written the book, but and I'm sure there was lots of quite clever business school studies about disruption, about railroads and airplanes and all this kind of stuff. But I'd studied philosophy, so I didn't know any of that stuff. So for me, it was just like, ooh, that's cool. The way things used to be done aren't the way they have to be done in the future, and I just kind of took the opportunity from it, I guess. And this thought that if you can imagine something, if you can think about a different way of doing stuff, and then you can make it happen, you can do anything. It was super exciting time.
That's something that really stayed with you for the rest of your career. and you took that forwards into when you went into agency side, right?
Yeah, absolutely. And I mean, I was lucky. I'd worked with entrepreneurial people, and I didn't really get into agencies until I was kind of a bit later on in my career. So I kind of came out the printers, had figured out at that point how to make websites, which was like the new thing to get involved with in like sort of like, I don't know, mid to late 90s. And had ended up building websites for banks, like publishing pricing and stuff like that. I didn't really, I mean, I was using Dreamweaver to do it. I didn't really understand the code even, but you know, but kind of known enough to do that. And from effectively hanging around doing internet stuff, I found my way into agencies as a digital strategist. I think just because I knew slightly more than anyone else, which was not very much at the time.
Did you have a clear path you wanted to pursue at that point? Because again, you've had this like mixture of technology inspired businesses and this like creative inspiration at the same time. When you left that printing company, did you have a clear idea like, okay, I've learned, now I know I want to get into this? Because those websites, you're building websites for banks and stuff, like, did you have in your head a path of what you wanted to be or pursue as the years went on?
I wish I could say yes, Anthony, but that's absolutely not true at all. I knew it was the internet. I knew it was something about these new digital technologies that were there that just fascinated me, but I had no idea what it was or how it was going to work or what role I would take. I just knew I was super interested in all of it. And it just fascinated me. So I would spend my life reading about stuff, meeting people, trying stuff, breaking things. Yeah, so I guess it's like more of a curiosity than a plan.
At that point too, I mean, you then a few years later, I think, moved on to working at American Express as the VP of Innovation. I mean, how did your career go from working at a printer in Hoxton to then working at American Express? Like, what were the intermediate steps that led to that moment?
Yeah. So I'd ended up I'd after I did a couple of years of kind of doing this financial services website design and publishing and ended up making a bit of money doing it, which was great.
Nice.
So I thought I'd set my own advertising agency up, which I'd never worked in an ad agency, was completely unqualified to do it. So I ended up setting like an interactive agency up with two of my buddies, which I did for a
Nice.
few years. We didn't make any money, but we had a lot of fun.
Wait, how do you define, like, what is an interactive agency? Like, what's the difference between that and just like another type of agency?
Well, back in the day, so that meant that we did CD-ROMs. so,
Wow.
so you
Wow.
you
Wait, you
would
design
do,
CD-ROMs?
yeah, so you would basically design, so you would use like direct multi-user server or Flash and things like that. So yeah, we did some stuff for B&Q, like the home hardware store. We did like an interactive CD for their catalog, and websites and all kinds of stuff, you know. So it just meant it was digital agency basically, but it wasn't really such a thing as digital agencies were very young and new. So, but yeah. And I ended up not making any money doing that. So I thought I'd better get some money because I've run out. So I ended up going to work at agencies. And I remember going into one of the agencies. I remember talking to someone about a job at M&C Saatchi, which is like, you know, a good advertising agency. And they had a direct and digital department, which is the kind of below the line sort of thing. And Mel Cruikshank, who's now Mel Edwards, who runs Wonderman, had sort of interviewed me and said, oh, I think you'd be a really good planner. And I was like, I don't even know what a planner is, you know, so which is, you know, a marketing, you know, advertising strategist, basically. And so I ended up doing that. And I had some really good bosses and mentors, really enjoyed this sort of like problem solving, I guess, and trying to understand audiences and people, and loved that. I met some great people there, worked on really good brands as well. And then ended up at AKQA, which is kind of big, really well known for Nike at the time. I think half of our revenue was Nike, and we built a lot of the apps and services there.
And advertising, you know, traditionally an old boys club, is that still true?
It's a really good question, Ben. So yeah, I think that advertising, I've worked in independent agencies, I've had my own ones, I've worked in big networks as well, in WPP and things like that. And I think definitely at the time it was privileged, it was who you went to school with. You would then get into the TV department of JWT or one of these other great places. I think what's happened in advertising now is it's kind of the middle's been knocked out of it, because it was basically, as media channels exploded, you didn't really need one big TV ad anymore. You needed like 3,000 small things, different things, and it was very complicated to manage. So I think people like JWT and AMV I know are struggling, or BBDO in the UK. So I think the middle ground's gone. I think the really good agencies, so with the guys at Uncommon, we know very, very well the founders of that. That's a brilliant agency. So I think great advertising agencies will do well. And I think they are more diverse and more mixed culturally, but it certainly come from a place of privilege and connection. It was the interesting thing that you did if you were a bit creative and brave.
And who are some of the people that would be working against those forces of kind of privilege and connection, and who wouldn't engage in that?
That's super interesting. I mean, the kind of, I think the conversations around diversity, around kind of like gender, around privilege, around race, they were something I wasn't even aware of until I was kind of like in my early 40s, so like 7 years ago. And I think particularly when I joined Facebook, I really started to understand a little bit more about what the privilege that I'd had as like a white straight guy who'd been pretty lucky and well connected. And so actually Facebook was very, very good for that. I got involved with a group called Creative Equals, which is run by Ali Hannon. And they're really great. And they're trying to redress the balance between creatives in the advertising industries. And I think only 13% of creative directors are women. The other 87% are men, and it's quite a hostile environment. So I've been working with Ali for a few years and learning from her. And then also done it like did a lot of work, did an amazing course of Fearless Futures, which was really good as well, and started to really understand kind of diversity and privilege and that kind of stuff a little bit more, and started to, you have to make a choice at that point and say, well, I'm going to be a force for good in there, and I use the privilege that I've got to help other people, because you would go to a lot of events that were around diversity and diverse recruiting, and it would all be underprivileged people who were there, and you're like, hang on a second, the people with the power, all of the, either wealthy privileged women or wealthy privileged guys, were not showing up to these things. And so that's something I think that that's something that I really took out from a couple of years ago, but it took me a long time to get there.
Got it. And I guess, while you're working at AKQA, was this something you said you kind of had more of an awareness of it while you were at Facebook, but earlier on when you were kind of in agency side, was this something you could kind of feel the grip of privilege on the work you were doing? Or was it something that just wasn't really kind of noticeable yet?
I would say I was too ignorant to understand it, I think. I think we all knew that the interns weren't paid enough money to actually support themselves. Like we made sure the interns were paid, but you clearly had to have your parents helping you out if you wanted to get a job there. You probably had to know someone who was there. So all these kind of quite subtle ways that that privilege kind of like enforces itself. So we were ignorant, I think I would say at the time. So it wasn't until much later that I had a better understanding of that.
It's really interesting. I mean, I guess because one of the things, particularly if you're in the creative industry on agency side, one of the things that strikes me as something that would make an agency successful is the ability to integrate a variety of different viewpoints into creative work and strategy that you're doing. And I guess kind of leading on from that, like what are some of the things to that point that you think make an agency really successful?
Yeah, no, Ben, I agree with you. I think that I think to be able to reflect the audiences that you serve, I think feels like table stakes now for an agency. And so, you have, women are a classic shopper audience for Unilever type brands, so broadly, women are making a lot of the purchasing decisions, but yet the adverts are generally not made by female creative directors. And you get into these really weird discussions with lots of bald men in black t-shirts, trying to figure out what it is that the shopper, this persona, this audience would really like. And I think that's when you're in a bad place. So I think that the agencies that can capture diversity, can capture culture, can really understand where culture's going and not just kind of like pastiche it, I think are going to be the ones that are powerful, the ones that are successful. And I think you can see that the more creative, the most awarded, the bravest ones are made of different types of people, who reflect the audiences.
So when you were at AKQA, you then moved on to a new role that was outside of the agency world. When you started working for American Express, like what prompted that change? Because it's still in the rough, industry, but what prompted you to go from agency side to go then work at American Express? And what was the role when you were there?
Yeah, so I'd really enjoyed. I ended up as planning director at AKQA. I really enjoyed it. We had amazing clients, and we were positioning ourselves as this kind of like digital innovation, transformation-y type thing. And this is in the sort of Clayton Christensen type era, So we did lots of stuff around automotive, financial services, kind of those sort of more traditional industries that were being disrupted in the way people were buying them. So like for automotive, like people traditionally had visited, I think, 6 different dealerships before they bought a car. And what we could see was that people were doing a lot more of the car purchase journey online, and they would typically visit like one dealership once they configured the car, printed the spec out, and everything else. So we could see that was moving, and American Express approached me and headhunted me basically, and said, look, we're trying to build this disruptive innovation capability in house. Are you interested in it? And at the time, I didn't understand the Amex products at all. I didn't really understand the brand because I was very kind of European in my outlook on the world. And so it took me a bit of convincing. And I went over from kind of Clerkenwell, where AKQA based, and everyone was like, apart from me, everyone was sort of super hip. And I went over to Victoria, where Amex were based. It was a very old school, traditional office. I was there in my kind of black T-shirt and scruffy jeans, and everyone was wearing suits, and it was all very beautiful, and it felt like a kind of slightly dated luxury hotel inside.
So why did you do it then? That seems like it would have been kind of a big culture shock for you. Like, what made you?
Yeah, it was, and I think. Yeah, I mean, I think with a lot of these, I think with career opportunities, one of the things that I've focused on is just like having a really good boss. Like if there's someone that you super connect with, and there was 2 or 3 people there that in the interview process that were really, really bright, and the organization intellectually was really, really strong, but they were very, very, very bright. They were really curious, and they knew things I didn't know. So I was going to learn from them, and I knew things they didn't know. So I was like, hey man, this could be awesome. They were also going to pay me a lot more money than the agency were. Which at the time was pretty cool because I think I had 2 kids and a 3rd one on the way, so that's always nice. But yeah, so there was quite a long dance around that. It was a very sort of formal suited environment, and they wanted to set up an innovation lab. They'd carved out like 40 people, a ton of money for a year, and they said, we want to run this disruptive innovation lab, which was super cool. And we ended up, and I was like, I'll come and work there, but I can't wear a suit. I don't have any, and it's not
in your contract.
Yeah, I don't think we got it into the contract. We had a verbal agreement with my boss that I didn't have to wear a suit and I could wear a T-shirt. And looking back on it now, I think, God, what a dick. I must have been walking around. Everyone must have been like, oh, God, that agency guy thinks he's so cool. But at the time, these are the bargaining chips. I think you've got to negotiate when you go into these roles.
I find it really, really interesting what you said about, there are 1 or 2 leaders who really stuck out to you in the interviewing process. Whenever I've been thinking about kind of new positions or making changes in my career, I've always tried to find people that I think, are super smart. They look at the world in a slightly different way. What were some of the things about these leaders that were like, okay, I want to learn from that person?
Yeah, it's a great question. I think that the like kind of American Express was one of the great corporates, I guess, of like 50s, 60s, 70s, 60s, 70s, 80s America, So like they were early in the game on things like data. So they had like early direct response capabilities where they could do things like if you were Hilton Hotels, American Express knew all the business people's details who stayed with your rivals. So they could enable you to send an offer to those people, and they had a very sophisticated gamification system around points. And they could it was just like a very sophisticated set of things that I hadn't seen before. And they were also super international. So the team that I was reporting into ran 22 international markets. So it was the rest of the world, as we called it at American Express, which was Canada and Mexico, Australia, Japan, India, all the European stuff. So it was just like, it was a completely different train set from the one I'd seen at AKQA, which was brilliantly exciting. But I wasn't as operational. I was very much upstream on concepts and insights, whereas these people were running a proper big business and were very sophisticated about the way they thought about effectiveness and numbers and financial performance. And I just thought, wow. And they had cool briefs. So we had 3, the innovation lab had 3 briefs. and they set up 3 different teams, each with one metric they had to run. So the first one was customer acquisition. So we wanted to figure out how to acquire customers using social media. That was the first brief. And that was my entry into Facebook effectively. The second team had to figure out how to get people to spend once more, how to use digital marketing to get people to spend once more per month on their Amex card. So how could you get one additional spend on the card? And then the last team was a loyalty team, and they had to figure out how to drive up net promoter score by like a meaningful amount. So they were cool briefs. They were like single metric focused, very, very good on the customer journey. And I found that really exciting.
At that time, what were some of the things that, so you were there for several years, or just?
I think I ended up doing two and a bit or something like that, which is good for me. Yeah.
Yeah. What were some of the things that probably surprised you the most about that new experience at a place like American Express? And two, like what are some of the things that you're most proud of that you've accomplished there in that interesting role?
So I think that so I learned a lot from the people around me. So really sophisticated international marketers. And I learned a lot about just running international businesses and about understanding how to balance between market perspective, regional perspective, and global perspective, which I know, Anthony's a lot of the stuff we were doing at Facebook as well. So just that big corporate beast stuff. I think that the level of focus that they had and the ability to make trade-offs was really cool as well. The acquisition team that was based out of Toronto, Markham, I think it was, were really cool, and they basically figured out pretty quickly that Facebook was the channel they wanted to work in, which was cool. So, and at the time, I think we had to serve 1 million impressions of Facebook ads, and these were like little on the side ads to try and get one card application. Yeah, and we had a really complicated system because you had to apply for an Amex card, then you had to go through a credit check, and if you got it, then you got to pay American Express the privilege of having a card. So it was a complicated buying journey, But starting from that, the team there started working directly with Facebook engineers. And we worked with Jason Lee, who's since become a really good buddy of mine. He runs one of the teams in New York at Facebook now on Creative Shop. So I worked with Jason then. And a bunch of other brilliant people in data science, and effectively that team started to work on custom audiences with Facebook around, it was the earlier custom audiences type time, so we learned tons of stuff about that, and a lot of the members of the team ended up going over to Facebook afterwards.
That's really cool.
Okay.
Yeah.
One of the things you said there is really interesting to me around the kind of balancing regional, national, international markets and the needs of them. Like, what are a couple of tips that you've taken out of your experience there on how to do that?
Well, it's super interesting. I've worked in different businesses where I've been in the local market, and then when I've been in Europe and global as well. And like Mini is a good example. I worked like UK Mini, and then I worked for Germany for the global Mini as well. And whichever seat you're in, you think the other people don't know what you're doing. They don't know what they're doing. Everyone's an idiot apart from you because you've got a different perspective to everybody else. So I think understanding everybody's perspectives is super important. And then you just have to make trade-offs. Like ultimately, if you've got 20 markets, each one of them will be able to do a slightly better campaign or a better activation for their single market. But the thing is, you need to get the economies of scale by doing things once. So the real trick is like, how can you have freedom in a framework for big markets? So how could you let China and the US do their own thing, maybe using a toolkit, and then your sort of mid and small markets take what they're given? So I learned a lot about that kind of like efficiency, effectiveness, and also keeping people happy. But my and this is it feels so weird now, like as we're not traveling much. But my boss at the time spent 70% of the time on the road, like in the markets, talking to people. And he said to me, "You've got to vote with your body. You've got to be there in person, and you've got to see people in the eye and have dinner with them, and just have good relationships with them." So it was a business that was built on relationships before video conferencing. So that meant getting on a plane.
That is so powerful and so important. What do you think led to success in that role? Like, what was the most important thing? Was it the sort of maintenance of stakeholders? Was it, because you think about like VP of innovation, right? Like you think about like what are the main metrics that would define that as a successful role? Like from your experience, was the most important thing keeping stakeholders happy? Was it coming up with some creative brand new idea? Was it something else?
I mean, the goal was always to scale stuff out of a lab and into the main business, And there were, I mean, I had a kind of advisory role and sort of digital strategy role for that, and there were leaders who ran each of the lab teams, and I kind of sat over them as an advisor basically for the main boss. So I think that what the business wanted to do was to rather than having to acquire startups, it wanted to make its own, which makes sense. I think what we all know now about corporate innovation is that the what do you say, the organ donor. So often the main body rejects the organ that's put into it, because actually you're doing stuff that isn't done the way that people like. It's on different timescales. It's not signed off. So I think there's a tough thing about corporate innovation where it's easy to do like innovation pilots, but as soon as you have to integrate into the main business, it's super hard because you didn't bring those stakeholders with you, and it's not their idea.
Totally, and it might even displace some of those stakeholders' jobs.
Yeah, totally. And Amex is an enormous corporate that was shrinking at that point. So it had too many people. Technology meant you needed less people. That meant that everyone was fairly worried about their roles and positions. So it was like, everyone was pretty sharp politically. Everyone was trying to defend their patch. And so I guess it's about finding people who wanted to make a difference and then trying to get projects to launch. I think that one of the US teams did a brilliant job. They launched like a coalition loyalty scheme called Plenty, which is a bit like Nectar in the UK, but they managed to get that scaled and into market, which was pretty awesome. And then obviously we scaled this Facebook acquisition work as well, which was that was pretty significant for us.
That's awesome. And I guess I love that kind of pull, don't push analogy, and find someone with a bit of a twinkle in their eye so they can help to pull it in. If you're looking at a huge organization and you're thinking, okay, different business units, different functions, how do I identify from my kind of view from the top who's right for helping me with this innovation? Like, how do I identify those people?
Yeah, I think it's super tough. We've been talking about this a lot over the last couple of months again. I remember at AKQA someone telling me, look for someone who wants a promotion. Mm-hmm. So this is back in the agency days. It's like, look for someone who's really hungry. And I think what that agency was great at was backing individual clients who were brave, and they would say, look, this client's done it. We'll then get them on a stage. We'll write a book with them, like really like in it for the long run. And someone like Luca De Meo, who's now the CEO of Renault Group, I was introduced to him at AKQA when he would just launched the Fiat 500 at Fiat, and he then went on to Volkswagen. So we were available to him at Volkswagen, and we helped him out as much as we could, and we ended up working there. So I think they back brave people is one good thing. Neeram was saying to me the other day, it's really about finding people with ambition that you want to work with. So you can find a really interesting brief. Someone can lay out something strategically, but if they present it to you and they look a bit flat and a bit dead in the eye, you got to ask why they're doing it. So you need someone who is more excited than you about it, and you need someone who's going to go and bend reality to make it happen.
And I can tell Anthony loves that quote, bend reality.
Of course. I mean, at that point, it's interesting that you went from the agency world to Amex to then Facebook. And I don't know if you know, Ian, but actually my very first client when I was at Facebook, when I started in New York, was Amex. So I did work with Amex for about like a year and a half. Maybe we probably knew some people. But what happened there? It seemed like you're working pretty closely with Facebook. So you were pretty aware of what Facebook was, which at the time still wasn't necessarily like mainstream advertising that everybody believed in. What were the steps that took you to then getting a job at Facebook, and then how did that unfold?
So I had a phone call at Amex from my boss, a guy called John Stewart, who's an incredible genius guy, and he had been my sponsor at American Express, and he told me, he wanted me to go and disrupt stuff. He wanted me to shake things up. He said, Ian, I want you to be the grit in the oyster that makes the pearl.
The grit in the oyster that makes the pearl. I need to get that as like a tattoo or something.
He's a great guy. You love him. He's great. And then he phoned me one day. He goes, Ian, I've decided I'm going to leave American Express. I was like, shit. This is basically my air covers.
Your guy.
My guy. So at that point you're kind of dead people. So I lasted another couple of months, I think. But yeah. So I came out of there, and a really good friend of mine, Nico Westerman, had gone over to Facebook from AKQA, and he was running the German market, Central European markets in the creative team there. and he was like, Ian, we're looking for someone to run the small business unit in the creative side, and also gaming. Like, I think you'd be really good at it because you're kind of businessy, but you're kind of creative, and you kind of understand performance marketing a little bit. I think it would be really cool. And I started the interview process, and the interview process at Facebook at the time took about 6 months, and I don't know what it was like for you, Anthony, but it was like, basically it was a slightly meandering kind of like, it was a journey. Basically, there was no clarity in it. It would go quiet for 2 weeks, and then suddenly you'd have to meet 4 people the next moment. Yeah. Okay,
Exactly.
cool. It runs its own rhythm, basically. So basically, I got partway through that process, and someone else offered me another job. So I took that job. So I ended up going to WPP as a chief strategy officer for one of their agencies, which was super interesting. But wasn't for me, and I left within a few months. So but ended up then ran my own consultancy for a year, worked with Adidas a lot. And then ended up eventually taking the job at Facebook. But it was a very long recruitment process.
And that's full circle, really. If you think like the very first moment when you took the when you were doing a lot of GMP game, GBP game.
Yeah. The game, exactly. All of the or play by mail. There we go.
Play by mail.
And role playing games. Yeah.
So you joined Facebook in the SMB and gaming space.
Yes. So I think when was it? 2015, I think. I started conversations in 2013, but ended up going in there in 2015, working with Rob Newland, who's brilliant. He's now running Virtue, which is Vice's agency globally. And Rob had said, we've got a huge gaming business, and it's all mobile app installs, this type of stuff. But they don't understand creative. They don't understand how to get people to buy stuff. How to get people to download stuff, how to communicate. It's pretty basic, And then we've also got all these small businesses. And at the time, I don't know how many there were, but but for every Unilever, there was hundreds of these e-commerce startups, and that was super interesting. So I ended up working in that team, and I really enjoyed it. Particularly, the gaming clients were brilliant. Like going to Israel a lot, very, very sophisticated, data-heavy kind of clients out of Ukraine as well, but the SMB, the small businesses, were amazing. So you'd have these businesses where someone had just imagined something, like Hut Group, I think is a really good example.
Yeah.
The X Phones for You guys, or Gymshark, or all of these businesses were super small. I wasn't necessarily involved with those businesses, but lots of business like this, lots of the mattress in a box businesses, all of this stuff, all the D2C stuff was happening. So it was very exciting. And what we'd known was that in the olden days, you'd have to go to JWT and spend like £1 million to run an advertising campaign. Like I think a film at JWT cost £1 million to make. I think HSBC used to make 12 a year. And that was before the media spend. So, but what we figured out, what we could see was that people could literally like get Photoshop and make an ad in like 20 minutes. So it was really democratized, and then some of my colleagues basically found a lot of the early mobile apps that let you kind of like edit video on them or overlay stuff. So I think there's still a whole thing, which is like, I don't know, like Mobile Studio for Facebook, which has got a bunch of tips and apps. And we learned a lot of best practice very quickly, which was that you need to get to the point very quickly in newsfeed. You need to like win in the first second. You need to say, what's the brand? What's your message? Make it very clear what the product is for performance marketing. And so we had to try and educate large amounts of these small businesses. We couldn't make all the ads for them.
So what are some of the top lessons that you would share with SMBs who are trying to create a brand digitally through social media?
Wow, Ben, that's a really, really good question. I mean, at the time, some of the sorts of things that we were doing, we would have like a few basic principles, and these are the classic ones that everyone knows about Facebook, like, brand and product really early in the first frame if you can, clear, optimized for mobile, square or vertical, this kind of stuff. And then a lot of it was like basic marketing common sense. It was like, who is your audience? What's the benefit? That kind of stuff. So understanding some of the marketing fundamentals was good. We ended up going on a, Facebook had a Facebook experts service for small businesses. And these was basically call centers of people who had a bunch of different scripts on how to help people out advertising. So we went and trained all of these call center operatives who may have worked for Accenture or someone else. In the same way they would tell you about implementing your pixel, we taught them about creativity. And in a very basic format, we sort of built a creative diagnostic flow chart, like the kind of thing you would have in a call center, where you'd ask them different questions and you would, prompt them to ask them something else. So I think understanding like creativity as a key ingredient of media effectiveness was something that wasn't there before. I think by the end we'd figured out it was like 50% of the effectiveness of the ad was down to the creative.
Wow.
Um,
What does the word creative mean in that setting?
So that would be the creative asset. So the thing that sits in the middle of the ad, the picture, the video, the words, whatever it is you're using, the call to action.
That's awesome. And I guess it's interesting as well, because one thing that I've heard a couple of folks say is that um, the way that the bidding system works on Facebook actually drowns out the voice of smaller businesses to the likes of Unilever. But I've never really kind of agreed with that. I think it gives SMBs enormous kind of comparable reach to what they would be able to have without social media. I'd love to know your take on that.
Yeah, I agree with you. I think Facebook democratized, growth and businesses, and I think media particularly. Like, back in the day, you'd have to get your ad made by JWT, and Mediacom or Mindshare would have to then buy your TV space, which would be hundreds of thousands of pounds. But if you had a mobile phone and you had like 10 quid, you could basically run an ad campaign. Now, it might not be very effective, but you could run it. I think back to your point about big advertisers drowning out smaller ones. What we definitely saw was that performance advertisers drowned out brand advertisers. So effectively, if you can, you're right, it's about bidding in the auction. If you can set your pixel up properly, so you're getting really good signal back from it, and you can set your creative up well, then your ad can be more effective than one from a big company, at which point you're more likely to win in an auction. So yeah. I mean, it was interesting, I think, when a lot of the brands pulled back spend in the middle of last year in terms of kind of like freedom of speech and stuff like that, Facebook's profits went up because more small businesses were going in there and the prices were cheaper in the auction. So
after having worked in printing, having worked at agencies, American Express, Facebook, you've kind of gone through quite a full arc of all the different aspects of like the media marketing advertising world. When it got to Facebook, had your opinion on certain things changed dramatically from what you might have thought when you're at Amex or when you're at AKQA? Did this progression in your life shift your perspective on things that you probably thought were true when you're at these other companies?
Yeah, totally. I think that you're always. I think it's about context you're in, isn't it, Anthony? Because the things that I valued when I were at Facebook were very much about how to use Facebook effectively. And if you just said to me, actually, there's some great SEO techniques and some stuff we could use for YouTube, I'd be like, that's kind of cool, but it's not going to impact my bonus. So I think we're all kind of creatures of our context.
And
yeah, no, for sure.
The other thing I'm really intrigued by is you obviously went through like various different elements of your career: Amex, agency side, Facebook, all the way through back to the print room where you first started. Like through that journey, what are some of the learnings about keeping the right mindset to be performing at the right level?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's if I look at my dad's career, he worked for the same firm for like 30 years. Like careers today feel very, very different to me, and certainly from other people that I speak to as well. And I think it causes a lot of uncertainty for people. And I would definitely say over the last year, particularly over this pandemic that we've been going through, I think most people have been having problems to do with anxiety, either to do with their careers or their lives or their situation. So I think like kind of like mental health is a real thing that happens to people, just like breaking your leg. And I think that everyone has to be gentle on themselves and recognize if they're a bit under the weather, but also a bit like kind of fitness as well, take steps to look after yourself. So things like mindfulness and meditation, things like trying to get some exercise, making sure you've got people to talk to. So I think definitely in terms of careers, where I see people struggling a lot is actually where they're probably, it's become more than a career thing. It's actually affecting their self-confidence a little bit. And I think it's good if you can recognize that's happening to you and actually go, hang on a second, maybe I'm not 100% fit at the minute. Get yourself to see your doctor and figure out, give yourself some space to get better, but don't beat yourself up too much. And I think like Sheryl Sandberg used to say that careers are kind of like a jungle gym. I think she used to say you kind of, they're not like a straight line upwards. You go across quite a lot and things are a bit different. So I say to people, like, look for experiences, don't look for promotions. You know, look to try and learn stuff. Don't look to like be leveling up all the time. I see a lot of people in their early 30s who are super burned out, going, yeah, but I need to be managing 6 people by the time I'm this age because my buddies from college are, and all that kind of stuff. And I think that's quite toxic.
Yeah.
What are some things that I guess in the lockdown, from your perspective, that you've worked on when it comes to thinking about career and life, and maybe just balancing things?
Yeah, it's true. One of the things I've been trying to do, I'm lucky my kids are getting a bit older, so I've got more time to myself, which sounds a bit crazy if you don't have kids. But basically, when your kids are younger, when they're small, you spend all of your time like changing nappies and running around after them. As they get a bit older, you have more time. And so I think like I always try and make sure that I'm learning something. I did the Seth Godin Alt MBA when I left Facebook, which I really, really enjoyed. I like 18 months ago, I started learning guitar again. I started learning flamenco guitar, and that's something that gives me like a lot of joy. Man. I've got my guitar.
Feel free to play something if you'd like.
No. I'm not quite there yet. I'm planning on a concert in the summer when lockdown's lifted. So I think like always learning.
Yeah. No, I just know we've all got our guitar right next to us right now.
You got to have your guitar. You got to have it next to you. Look at that, amazing. See, you got to have it because if someone's late for a Zoom call, you can practice. Best way of doing it. My main achievement in lockdown was learning how to cycle with no hands, which is something I could never do as a kid.
Nice.
And so, obviously in London, cycling's brilliant, and particularly in lockdown, there's a lot less cars. So I've been just cycling as much as I can. I think I did 3,000 kilometers last year. But my goal is just to cycle as much as possible. And obviously learning to cycle with no hands is the kind of achievement a 48-year-old man is aiming at.
But you know what? I think there's something in that because I think that shows kind of a childish playfulness. And I think that that's really healthy.
Yeah, I think so. I think when you think that you can't take pleasure from those things anymore, that's kind of not a good sign, So I think if it's saying, do you know what? I've never really figured out how to do that. I've always been awful at DIY and at fixing things. And actually I'm like, you know what? I'm going to try that now,
Yeah.
I think and it'll be messy.
That's an attitude you also shouldn't take for granted, because not everybody has that same willingness to try and learn new things, like being 48 years old and trying to learn a new way to ride your bike and a flamenco guitar. So it's a powerful but seemingly simple thing to do, to have this always be learning mindset.
Yeah, I mean, I think back to our conversations in a more kind of corporate land about growth mindsets and about change management. Like, your classic thing you need is people who are not afraid to fail, who are curious about new things, and I think also not being too concerned. The status quo is not going to last forever. Every day is going to be harder than today, so you almost have to make the leap into the next island or whatever that's going to be. I think that's definitely something that makes me happy, is kind of having that mindset. And it's not always there. I have anxiety and stress like everybody else does, but I know on a good day, I'm excited about the next thing, and I'm not too precious about what I have at the moment. I always want to try and move on,
Well, in that case too, I mean, Ian, you have moved on from Facebook to now starting your own company. Can you talk about that for a little bit, and what maybe the inspiration was, and what's Def doing right now?
Yeah, sure. So myself and Niran left Facebook in the middle of last year. What certainly I could see, and I won't talk from Niran's point because he can talk for himself, but no, what I could see was that the old agency model that we were talking about then had really changed, and that a lot of advertisers had in-house teams. So they would have in-house media and in-house kind of creative teams together, and some of them had really big teams, some had smaller teams, but the action was inside the client. It wasn't at the agency. But what I could also see was that these teams often needed some sort of external help or stimulus, like cracking a certain problem. So we've set up Deft as a kind of culture and commerce advisory business. We've got a good network of ex-Facebook and kind of other expert people. And broadly, we can kind of come into sort of scale up businesses, typically ones that are turning over $10 million or more a year, primarily Facebook-centric businesses, or more traditional e-commerce businesses, and just help them unlock new growth, either from better creativity, using some of the media experts that we've got to change the way that they're planning and buying media, or fixing stuff around their brand or how they're using influencers or product or whatever. So a bit of everything, but all really around commerce and particularly retail, fashion, beauty, that kind of stuff.
Where should people find and learn more about Deft?
Amazing. So if you go to www.deft.be, so deft.be, which is a cheap Belgium domain name.
Nice, nice. And should people connect with you as well, like on LinkedIn? Are you on Twitter? Are you iancrocombe.com? Like
LinkedIn has like Twitter kind of like I stopped using Twitter when I was at Facebook, and I went back on it afterwards, and it freaked me out a bit. I was like, wow, it's like all of humanity here, and it's not been through an algorithm. It was a bit much for me. So yeah, LinkedIn is good. It's where the old white men are, and I'm there, you know. So, awesome. But yeah, no, but connect with me on LinkedIn. I'm super happy to have like mentoring. If anyone's interested, who's got career advice, or if there's anything that we've had on tonight, or anything you're thinking about, you want to chat with, you know, always happy. Like one of my goals for this year is to help more people thrive. So, you know, if you think that having a half an hour chat with me could help you fix something, hit me up on LinkedIn.
And that's business and personal?
Business and personal, yeah. I wouldn't take fashion advice from me, but yeah, anything to do with like anything, like career, mental health, self-esteem, anything, you know. I won't always give you a very good answer, but I'm always happy to have a chat.
Okay, I might take you up on that later. But Ian, we have 2 questions that we usually ask people at the end that we'll go through right now before like doing some last minute shout outs. But what is your favorite romantic comedy, rom-com?
Oh, Anthony, you know, that's hard. Under Siege 2, I think.
Under Siege 2.
Yeah, he's the chef, no? Yeah.
I don't think I've ever even heard of that.
Yeah. I'm like Googling this right now because I don't know. Like, wait, is this Steven Seagal?
Yeah, he's a chef, but actually he's an ex like Navy SEAL.
Yeah. And is it like why? Why is this your choice?
I just like, for me it's like kind of it's like a moment of escapism. Like it's a ridiculous, awful American film, but there's something about it that just gives me joy. You know, there might be romance in it, but the main thing is like when the bad guys figure out he's the chef, but actually he's like an ex-Navy SEAL, and it kind of he starts throwing knives at them and stuff. It's cool.
Well, that is our first submission to this, which has got under 40% on Rotten Tomatoes.
Yes, exactly. That tells you why I've got very bad taste. So, yeah.
The second, a little bit more serious. What would you tell an 18-year-old Ian sitting across from you at the table?
Oh well, I've got a 17-year-old one of those. So,
what's the okay?
I tell him to go to bed earlier. Is generally my tip. No, I know. I think it's about being curious and about finding stuff that you enjoy doing. So, you know, just like, don't worry too much about a career. Don't worry about having it all figured out. Just find things that you're interested in and kind of like just dig deep into them, and that will give you joy, you know, and you'll learn stuff. So be curious.
Thank you, Ian. Any last shout outs or any other things you want to leave with the audience, apart from reaching out to you on LinkedIn and def.be?
Yeah, no, I mean, just thank you very much for your time. Ben and Anthony, it's been great to talk to you. And if anyone has listened all the way to the end, well done. Thank you.
Thank you, Ian. Thanks.